Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. Linode is sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. We also have a new sponsor this week. Rollbar is a service for tracking and aggregating your application errors so that you can find and fix the bugs in your application before your users notice they exist. Use the link rollbar.com/podcastinit to get 90 days and 300,000 errors tracked for free on their Bootstrap plan. Visit our site to subscribe to our show, sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. To help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes, Google Play Music, and tell your friends and coworkers about it. You can also join our community. Visit discourse.pythonpodcast.com for your opportunity to find out about upcoming guests, suggest questions, and propose show ideas. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Tom Dyson about Wagtail, a modern and sophisticated CMS for Django. So, Tom, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, it's good to be part of this. My name is Tom Dyson. I'm the technical director and co-founder of Torchbox, which is a web agency based in the UK with a small office in the US.
How did you get introduced to Python?
So I started Torchbox in 2000, grown slowly over the years. In the first few years, we used quite a wide range of technologies and programming languages, and that was a period of very fast change in the web industry. So we were building sites in Cold Fusion, which I doubt many of your listeners are familiar with. Also with Perl and PHP, and then we played with Ruby and Rails, and we built a couple of big Java-backed sites. But somewhere in those first few years, I learned Python, really as a sort of more readable alternative to Perl. So it was initially for scripting and sysadmin type work, systems work. But it really connected with me. And then sometime after that, Django appeared, and that kind of combination of beautiful language and a very well thought out web framework meant that Django and Python became the de facto choice for the technical parts of our organization.
And for anybody who's not familiar with the concept, can you start by explaining what a content management system is and why they're useful?
A content management system, which I'll henceforth abbreviate to CMS, is a very standard tool, and most of the websites that you will interact with online will be backed by a content management system. So this is a tool which allows editors and administrators to manage the content without writing HTML by hand. And they vary in sophistication from simple single-user systems which generate flat files to large so-called enterprise packages which have things like custom workflow and media management for massive amounts of assets and data.
And how did the Wagtail project get started, and what makes it stand out from other comparable offerings?
So we've been building content managed websites for I guess nearly 15 years, and we had our own content management system, something called Rational Media, which we started in about 2003, 2004, and it ran some big sites, people like University of Oxford, and it was well liked by its users, but it wasn't open source, and increasingly we realized that it wasn't really sustainable for us to carry on offering a piece of software that was critical to our clients' business that was only supported by one small company in the UK. So we looked around for open source alternatives, and after some considerable research, we picked Drupal, a PHP content management system, and which has really picked up in momentum over the last decade and run some very big, well-known sites. And Drupal's been good for us as a business. We carry on building Drupal sites, but at the same time, we've felt some frustrations with technical aspects of Drupal, and I guess over the last few years we've been waiting for somebody else to provide an open source content management system that behaved in the way we wanted, but it never quite came. And obviously there are some great projects out there. There's lots of very impressive software, but nothing that worked really in the way that suited us and our clients. So in late 2013, we started working with the Royal College of Arts, who are a very distinguished arts university in London, in the UK. And they had also done an analysis of the open source options for content management. And they had some specific requirements of their own, and none of which were met, or at least not all of which were met by any existing products. So they commissioned us to build them a new content management system, and with the agreement that it would be open sourced at the end. And so it was the project of building that site, rca.ac.uk, that was the birth of Wagtail. So shortly after the launch of that site, we spent a couple of months pulling out the bits that were specific to the client, and starting the open source project, giving it a name, giving it a brand, and then we launched it at a small Django conference that was hosted in Wales called the Django Weekend in February 2014. As for what makes it stand out from other comparable offerings, there are a few principles which I might talk about in more detail later. One is that this content management system should be optimized for the developer and not for the administrator. And that's a slightly difficult point to make sometimes, and it's certainly not an easy point to sell. But it's something that's we found really important, and I feel like that decision's been vindicated by the way that Wagtail's worked for us and apparently for other developers as well. So just to talk a little bit more about that, Drupal is an example of very powerful software that allows editors or administrators of the site to for example, to create new types of content and to group those types of content and to list them without writing any code. So there's a user interface with checkboxes and fields, and behind the scenes that will create new tables and relationships. And the promise of a system like that is that as the owner of a website, you will need to depend less on the developer organizations who are providing it, and to manage it more yourself. But so this is something that's, it's a compelling pitch, and it's something that's that can be very powerful. But in our experience, those features are used rarely, and they cause problems for developers, because the technologies that make that flexibility possible get in the way of developers. So as a template designer, you're always having to think about what other types of content might be inserted here. You also get problems with disparities between development and staging and production environments, because the configuration of the type of data is managed in the database itself, not in code. So with Wagtail, we made a very clear decision not to take that route, and to handle things like model changes using the tools that developers like best, which is text files in code, and Git for version management, and migrations in Django for applying those changes, and deployment tools for making sure that your staging and production environments are kept in sync.
And what made you choose Django as the basis for the project as opposed to another framework or language such as Pyramid, Flask, or Rails?
I guess primarily it was a pragmatic decision based on our familiarity with Python compared to PHP or Ruby. Clearly there were alternatives like Pyramid and Flask. I had followed Simon Willison's blog pretty closely in the early 2000s. This is sort of in the days before Hacker News. He had the best listing of new technologies, and he wrote in a very interesting way. I didn't realise at the time that he was probably a teenager when he was writing most of that stuff. And so I was following him, and then and enjoying Python. And then when he co-wrote Django and announced it, then that was something I was immediately interested in, and I got I followed it very closely. I think I know that I made the first screencast for Django, which is a sort of brief moment of fame in the Django community, and I think it's a framework that's served us very well. It's become a very supportive and friendly community, and it's something we're really proud to be part of.
So what is your target user, and are there any situations in which you would encourage someone to use a different CMS?
At the moment, our target users are definitely developers, and And I guess that's another way that might be helpful to differentiate Wagtail from other systems. And certainly that's the way that Wagtail has become known as an open source project over the last 2.5 years. It's not so much through head of digital or an organization or management level. It tends to be developers, particularly Python and Django developers, who see Wagtail and like the approach and recommend it to use in their organization. Most of the sites we see built on Wagtail, aside from our own, are fairly large sites. So the kind of site where you might have thousands, tens of, maybe even hundreds of thousands of pages, media files, and maybe tens of editors. And it's certainly not required for that, and there are also lots of beautiful blogs built on Wagtail. But I think that the sweet spot for Wagtail is probably an organization which has skillful developers and designers, and clearly which understands Django, and which needs some of the more powerful features that Wagtail provides. As for situations where we encourage someone to use a different CMS, I think, as I said before, there are lots of fantastic alternatives. For myself, if I were making a simple website for a friend and I had an evening to do it, then I'd probably more likely pick WordPress, because I know that I can get it hosted in 10 minutes on WordPress.com and pick a theme, and it's a quicker way to make a simple site. Or I might look at Jekyll or Pelican or one of the other static site generators. Otherwise, Wagtail's like I said, it's used for a pretty wide variety of some really very large sites, down to some beautiful blogs. So it's if you know Django and you're willing to create the look and feel and to write the HTML and CSS yourself, then Wagtail should be a good fit for you.
So can you explain the software design approach that was taken with Wagtail and describe some of the challenges that have been overcome along the way?
I guess the primary principle is the one that I've mentioned already, that we should optimize for developers, and that's been something that we've been clear about internally. When I say internally, I mean that's slightly out of date now, because although Wagtail was created here at Torchbox, it's now a large open source project with some fantastic agencies supporting it. Some really notable examples are Springload in New Zealand, who are running the first New Zealand Wagtail meetup tonight, and Take Flight in Tasmania, Australia, Lukien in the Netherlands. Lots of great agencies and other large organisations around the world. But certainly the initial design approach was around optimising for developers, and I guess a challenge that brings is that the initial experience of using Wagtail might feel slightly underwhelming compared to some of the alternatives, because you set it up, you install it, that all happens pretty quickly now, and you create a Wagtail instance, and you have a very uninspiring plain page with a couple of lines of text, and in the back end you have a single home page with one content, with one field in it, and then it's left to you to create your site, to build your models and your templates on top of that. So I think that's a challenge of taking this kind of the purist approach, is that the initial experience can be less exciting. As for other software design approaches, another clear principle is that we're not opinionated about the markup that's used in the front end. So you can use whatever CSS, JavaScript framework you like. It may even be that you choose to use Wagtail as a so-called headless CMS, and the client is a JavaScript application or a native mobile application. And I guess that also can contribute to this sense that it's a very blank canvas when you start. But within that framework of giving implementers freedom, we also want to encourage people to make websites in a way that is good for the web, which maybe sounds a bit contradictory, because it maybe sounds like we're being a bit opinionated here. So we're not forcing people to do things, but we're just making sure that Wagtail, I guess, doesn't make it easy to do things badly. So an example of that is quite a controversial example on the GitHub issue list is the inability to create links that open in new windows, which is a frequent request, and lots of people have asked for a setting or that would mean that you could open links in new windows, or at least have the option to toggle that. And I think that's something that you can do yourself by putting it in your templates, but it's we don't think that opening links in new windows is good for usability, and then it can lead to some anti-patterns in interface design. So I guess we've made a decision for Wagtail at least not to make that easy for people.
Yeah, it's easy enough to just control click on a link if you want to open it in a new tab, so having that decision forced upon the user is sometimes non-intuitive and frustrating.
Right, I agree.
You mentioned that Wagtail has the ability to be used as a headless CMS so that you can do a single-page app style front end and then just use Wagtail as delivering content over an API, which I think is one of the distinguishing factors of Wagtail versus a lot of the other CMSs that are available, which are more tightly integrated between back and front end. So I think that is a pretty innovative approach and definitely very forward-thinking, because that's the way that a lot of modern web applications are going, is using the single page front end, single page app style with a heavy JavaScript front end and an API back end. So I think that's one way to stay relevant as the current state of the art progresses.
Right. Thanks for making that point better than I did. That is an important aspect of Wagtail, I think, and it's something that became clear to us quite early on in Wagtail's history, where we were commissioned by it's a very high-profile site in the US that we're not allowed to talk about yet. I hope we will be able to do sometime in the next year or so. But it's definitely a site that you will have heard of. And they commissioned us to build the first API for Wagtail, precisely for this reason, because for the particular purpose of this site, it does deliver pages, but a more important aspect of it is that it's going to use Wagtail as, or it is now using Wagtail as a system for managing content and for handling the workflow and moderation around that, and asset management and so on. But that content will be delivered through APIs to mobile phones, both on mobile optimized websites, but also native sites, using some pretty tightly segmented rules around location and so on. And so that was, it was great to have that commission and to build that into Wagtail, and that was an early indication of the way that, as you say, I think it's an emerging trend in content management systems. Since then, there's been quite a lot of focus on the API. Tom Christie, who's the author of the Django REST framework, which is really the preeminent app for building REST APIs in Django, he contributed a refactoring of our initial API using Django REST framework, and we're currently working on a separate API which is currently labelled the admin API, and this is going to enable us to make a cleaner distinction between models and the interface in the Wagtail UI itself. So we've got lots of ideas around improving the user interface, and I think the first step of that is going to be trying to disentangle the slightly kind of jQuery spaghetti we have at the moment and make Wagtail itself a cleaner, probably a React-based app. And that reminds me of something else I should talk about in terms of distinguishing features for Wagtail, and that's its user interface. So there are, as you and your listeners will be aware, there are plenty of really mature and interesting content management systems in Django. Some of the more famous ones are Django CMS and Mezzanine and Fine CMS. And I think Django's always been, right from its history as a tool for building newspaper websites, it always feels like a good fit for content management systems, because the automatic admin interface makes it very easy and to create a pretty attractive and effective tool for managing your models. But in a way, that automatic and easy admin interface has been an issue, has been a problem in some ways for Django, because it's so easy to do that often people who are implementing tools on top of it will stop there, and then they won't think any harder about the way that their editors or authors or their users want to interact with the content. And that's something that we took pretty seriously with Wagtail, and I guess it's because originating at Torchbox, where we're not just programmers but also designers and UX people and testers and so on, that meant that we could apply all of that experience and to building a new product. And I think that was one of the reasons why Wagtail made a bit of a little splash when we launched it, because it looks pretty and it feels good, and it feels different to a lot of other Django-based open source projects. And that focus on user experience is something that we've we've maintained in the last couple of years, and it's an area that we're making a particular push on in the next 6 months.
And also, since you're comparing Wagtail to some of the other Django CMSs available, I'd also like to call out the fact that you are one of only 2 or 3, I believe, of the, I think, dozen or so that are available that actually supports Python 3 natively.
Right. Yeah. That's we just within Torchbox more generally, we're very keen to support Python 3. And wherever possible, we start new projects on Python 3. That is almost always possible these days, and so that it felt like making sure that we had that Wagtail was supporting Python 3 from the beginning was a small but important to us contribution to the progress of Python 3.
So how did you approach the project in a way to make the CMS feel well integrated into the other apps in a given Django project so that it doesn't feel like an afterthought?
I think this is something that we've got a bit better at over the last 2 years, and in fact there was perhaps a bit of a misconception that Wagtail was more of a standalone app than it really is. But in fact, I mean, really, it just inherits from Django the ability to integrate well with other apps. And one of the most common answers that we give to questions about can Wagtail do such and such is it's just Django. It is just a Django app, and it can sit in your existing app as a content management part of something more complicated you're doing, or you can choose to make Wagtail the primary app and to attach other apps to it. And I think this is a really clear strength of Django from the beginning, that it's not only enabled but promoted that kind of architectural approach, and so it's something that we inherit. Having said that, I think there are definitely ways you can make that easier, and I guess the most obvious one for us is providing hooks into different aspects of Wagtail's functionality. And I think this is something that we ought to keep pushing forward with, and perhaps I ought to have a little mini roadmap of hooks to be added. And adding hooks is a pretty straightforward thing to do. But examples of the hooks that Wagtail offers you are the ability to add other apps into the menu, or to carry out, to call functions at time of saving or publishing. So a standard example for that might be that if you were using Varnish or Cloudflare or something as a caching proxy in front of your site, that when you publish a page you might want to purge the cache using the API for Varnish or Cloudflare or so on. So that kind of hook ecosystem has got richer over the last couple of years, but I think there's still more that we could do there.
And for somebody who wants to get started with using Wagtail, what does that experience look like? And is there a difference if they already have an existing Django project that they're trying to integrate it with versus starting fresh?
Well, on the starting fresh question, it's a bit of a mixed bag, I think. It was a key focus of mine in the first few months to make it as simple as possible, and we made some good improvements in this area. So, as an example, we use Vagrant quite heavily at Torchbox, and as a way of standardizing our builds and making it easy for designers to collaborate with developers on projects without having to try and install the Postgres drivers on their Macs. And we kind of we erroneously assumed that most of the rest of the Django community use Vagrant too. So to start off with, Wagtail was the installation instructions recommended Vagrant heavily, and we quickly realised that lots of the rest of the community work in different ways, and so in the first few months we tried to really streamline that process. So Mezzanine was one of the content management systems I mentioned before. It's one of the CMSs which the aspects of that which inspired our approach for Wagtail. And one thing I really liked out was their 3-line installation instructions: pip install, in our case pip install Wagtail start project X, and then you cd into project X and manage py run server, migrate and run server. So it's a kind of 3 lines to get started on assuming you have a working Django environment or a working Python environment. So that's the good bit. Like the bad bit is, I guess, what I mentioned before is that because of our approach of providing a blank canvas, the initial experience is somewhat underwhelming. As for integrating with other apps, that's our documentation. That's always been fairly straightforward, but our documentation for that has improved recently. So I hope that any of your listeners who do want to integrate Wagtail with their existing apps find that pretty straightforward.
So what are some of the features that are unique to Wagtail which somebody wouldn't be able to find in a different CMS framework?
The first I'm going to talk about is called Streamfield, and this is again, it's not a feature that's particularly easy to describe. And if your job was selling commercial content management system, you might hope for something a bit more glamorous to be at the top of your list. But as people who've been building content managed sites for 15 years, Streamfield answered a problem we'd experienced, and we've discovered it's solved that problem for us, and it might not be a right fit for everyone, but we've had a lot of very, very positive feedback about it. So I guess if I could start describing Streamfield by talking about two different approaches to content management. And one end of the scale, at the kind of structured, strict end of the scale, you could imagine building a new page, say an events page for your site, and deciding up front all the different types of content that you're going to have on that page. So there's going to be some obvious things like title and the date, and maybe the location. But then also you might want to build a richer page that's got speaker bios, or the types of food that are going to be available at the event. And one option is that you just create fields for all those type of content, and you make some of them optional, and that will just cope with all the different types of event that you might have in the future. Another option is it's more like the sort of standard WordPress approach, where you have a big text area with a WYSIWYG editor in it, and you use markup to make tables and insert images and make subdivisions and so on. And the problem with a strict approach is that it's inflexible, and it requires the implementer of the site to make a lot of decisions which may not turn out to be correct. The problem with the second approach is that it means all your data is tied up in HTML, and often not very nicely formatted HTML, and that means that it's much harder to reuse and to repurpose that content. For example, if you wanted to create a mobile site, or a native mobile app, or even an ebook for your content. So the Wagtail's Streamfield feature, which landed in 1.0 about a year ago, is a sort of middle ground, which allows you as the site developer to create a different type of field. So after you've made your title and your date and your location, then you might have a Streamfield field, and you define the kinds of things that could go in that stream field, like an image, or an embedded video, or a quote, or a link to a speaker. And then that gets modeled in JSON in the database, which means it's still structured data that can be filtered and can be accessed through the API, but feels much more kind of free form to the editor, and it allows you to create these richer, more sort of narrative style content that you increasingly see with sort of long scrolling pages with full screen maps and videos and kind of rich content, but in a way that gives control to the editor without tying up all your data in HTML. Sorry, this is a rather roundabout way of trying to describe Streamfield, which is much easier to understand if you use it, but the upshot of all that is that Streamfield-enabled Wagtail sites allow a much higher level of flexibility than we've seen in other content management systems.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you digging into that, because that was actually a question that I had a little later on, was asking about Streamfields, because I definitely think it's a very innovative approach to that problem. I was actually looking at using Wagtail possibly for a project I was working on that didn't end up coming to fruition, but stream fields was one of the determining factors in looking at that because, as you said, there is this tension between flexibility in the layout and ordering of content in a CMS versus making it easy to update and maintain. And I think Streamfields does a good job of basically letting you have a defined set of components that are available within a given area of the page or content structure, and then being able to, at edit time, determine what ordering and what composition those different components are going to be done in. So for instance, if you had, like you said, a text block and then maybe a UI component, maybe like a card paradigm, and then a couple of links, and you wanted to be able to arrange those differently based on the specific content that you're putting in, I think Streamfields does a really good job of doing that and also providing some structure for somebody who is producing the content and isn't necessarily familiar enough with HTML or CSS, being able to say, here are some different pieces that you can put together and you can sort of cut and paste them in the order that makes the most sense for what you're trying to present.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad it feels like a good fit for you. And also, I think the way that you express it makes a lot of sense. And for some reason, it's something that I always slightly struggle to describe, but I think you and others have put it better. I think it harks back slightly to the point I was making before about trying to encourage developers to build sites in a good way, in a kind of future-proof way. And although Wagtail has the so-called rich text field, which can also be part of a stream field, which has the standard formatting controls that you're used to for bold and italics and lists and so on, we really try to encourage site implementers not to use those features as little as possible. And I guess in the long term, it'd be nice to eliminate that altogether, and by making Streamfield better, so that if you paste 4 paragraphs of text into the box, rather than it being one field containing paragraph blocks, it'd be nice if it automatically created 4 different Streamfield paragraphs that you could reorder or insert other content into, and was maintained as structured data behind the scenes in a way that makes it reusable. I'll move on to a couple of other features after Streamfield. So one is around image management, which was particularly important to our first user, the Royal College of Art, and I think it's been a strength of Wagtail's ever since then. We use search, I guess, as the primary mechanism for accessing images in the UI. So if you have Elasticsearch, then that gets used. So it's really quick to locate images. But more importantly, there are some features around how images are displayed, and one is this idea of focal points, which addresses something an issue that we've had in the past. So quite often you might have a large image. For example, it could be a portrait of a person where the head is at the top right of the image, and you might show that full width on a detail page about that person. But you also want a listing of those pages. For example, if you've got a page listing all the people in your team and you just want a thumbnail. And there's a couple of options for doing that. One is that you could just resize the image, but then the part that you're interested in could be really small. And others, you could automatically crop it in the middle, but then you might cut the head off. And we've added a couple of features to Wagtail to help with that. One is the ability for editors to define focal points. So you can drag an area around the bit of your image which is most relevant. So I guess that might most commonly be the face, and that means that when the thumbnailing library works, it will hone in on the focal point of the face. So you can automatically generate thumbnails which include the part that you've defined as being relevant. Also, you can turn on feature detection, which means that you could automatically, if you've got hundreds of thousands of images like some Wagtail users have, and you don't have time to specify focal points, then Wagtail can use the underlying image recognition libraries to define the features and the faces in the image. So that's something I think that we haven't highlighted enough, and it's quite a powerful part of Wagtail. I guess it wouldn't be relevant to all users, but it certainly is to us. And finally, if you can call it a feature, just to mention the UI again, I think this is something that does distinguish Wagtail, and it's kind of a feature because there are other, like I said before, capable systems, but something I've heard several times from people is, I did an analysis of the open source CMSs, and but Wagtail was the first one that I felt happy to put in front of my client. Design that most people should use it without training, which is can be a hidden cost to implementing some of these sites, and I think largely it's been successful with that in that goal.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the admin is a very good feature and very well put together. Having played around a little bit with the Wagtail project, I definitely appreciated the polish and considerations that were put into designing that admin interface, because having used WordPress, for instance, a little bit, that admin interface can become rather confusing, particularly as you add different plugins to it. Just trying to figure out where you're supposed to do different tasks. And I think that out of the box, Wagtail does a good job of presenting an easy way of getting into producing that content.
Yeah, I agree. I think WordPress out of the box is there's some really nice touches on it, but once you start trying to build anything more complicated, then you quickly rely on plugins. And as you say, I think the story changes a bit.
And I wasn't aware of the automatic feature recognition and the focal points on the images. That definitely sounds like a very useful feature for anybody who has any sizable number of images that they're dealing with. So I'm sure that simplified a lot of people's days when they found out about that.
Yeah, I hope so.
Given that Wagtail is such a flexible tool, what are some of the gotchas that people should watch out for as they're working on a new site?
I guess the first thing is that it doesn't. I feel like I'm probably saying this too often, but it doesn't help you get started with your new site, other than providing the data you need and the way to manage it. Actually, I mean that's a bit of an exaggeration, because it makes use of the excellent template tag system that Django provides. So there are a number of tags for things like images and embeds, but otherwise it relies on you understanding the elegant and powerful templating tools that Django provides. Incidentally, I mean, we're not big Ginger 2 users here at Torchbox, but I know lots of people are, and that it has a number of advantages over the standard Django templating. And I think performance can be quite. You can see dramatic performance gains in some situations, and Wagtail does have Ginger 2 support for those who need it. But the things that people should watch out for, I mean, I guess there's just the things that you can, mistakes that you can make with any site, and primarily they probably come around to the way that your content architecture has been designed, making sure that the information architecture is correct, that you haven't made too many assumptions in your models before testing. Wagtail doesn't, I guess, like any tool, doesn't really help you with that stuff.
So does Wagtail have any built-in support for multi-tenancy?
Yes, it does, and this was a kind of key requirement from the beginning. As a product that was originally built for university and has been used at many universities since, then this kind of setup where you're running maybe one major site and a handful of smaller sites is something that is enabled. So you define a site, and then you can assign point in the tree. So I should just backtrack a bit and say that Wagtail has a kind of built-in idea of a page hierarchy, which is another point that not all content management systems do this, but it in our experience, this was the best fit with the way that our users thought about their sites. And so you assign a point in your page hierarchy to the site record that you've created, and then so all requests for that domain or subdomain will be routed to that point. So that's always worked, and there's a few nice examples of that, but there are some improvements that can be made there, and actually, and another university at Caltech at the moment are looking into Wagtail, and the developer Robert Rowlands there is currently contributing to some work, which is a pull request on GitHub, around improving the multi-tenancy support, and particularly around visibility. So there's already kind of pretty solid permissions for who can edit and manage content, but at the moment it's on a kind of basis that you can see everything, you can see all the other sites, and generally, or at least for the sites that we built, that hasn't been a problem. But you can imagine for a multi-tenancy implementation where you have tens or hundreds of sites running off the same instance, then it just would be confusing for users who are only interested in their own 10-page site to see all the other ones and to be able to select the images from other ones and so on. So he's been working on the kind of reducing the visibility. And we've also recently, in the last version, 1.4, introduced a concept called collections, which is an idea for creating buckets of content for documents or images or media items that are, again, typically assigned to sites. So this is a fairly simple way of segmenting material so that if you need to, you can assign permissions to different groups of non-page content.
And going back briefly to the concept of plugins, does Wagtail have a plugin system to allow developers to create extensions to the base CMS?
Yeah, it does. And, I don't know if calling it a plugin system is a bit grand. I mean, it inherits Django's ability to make it easy to add apps, and there are a number of hooks. And there's also, a growing range of existing third-party tools. And I think if your listeners are thinking about adding a plugin to Wagtail, then the best place to start would be to look at some of the existing tools. So at the very simple end is one that I wrote a few months ago at a sprint we had in Cape Town. That was this new plugin provides integration with Google Analytics. So you can there's a page within the admin that shows the recent activity on your site, and the next version of that, if I get around to it, would be to have per page information. So when you're editing a page, you can see how many users have been on that page in the last week. That's a really simple plugin, and but on the other end of the scale is something like a plugin called Wagtail Model Admin, which was developed by Andy Babick at another agency here in the UK. And we're increasingly aware that lots of high-profile, high-complex Wagtail sites are making use of Wagtail Model Admin, which actually, I mean, it itself may mean that you don't need to write a plugin, because it's a sort of generic tool for integrating your other Django apps into Wagtail itself. So if you want to manage non-Wagtail content within Wagtail, Model Admin makes it really easy. It's I mean, you could think of it as a bit like the automatic admin that Django provides, but re-implemented in Wagtail itself. So I guess that's an example. I mean, apart from being an interesting feature in its own right, and one that's going to be merged into Wagtail itself in forthcoming 1.5, it's also an example of how kind of rich and complex a plugin you can build on top of Wagtail.
So, having built such a sizable project with deep integrations to Django, what are some of the shortcomings in the framework that you would like to see improved?
So there are a couple of things that we've worked around, and actually, and through the process of working around them, we've released some released software that helps. But one of those is around images. So I guess most Python and Django developers will be familiar with Pill or Pillow, which has it's high performance, great quality, and does most of what you need an image manipulation library to do. But there are some missing features. So, for example, the functionality around animated GIFs isn't great. And there's an alternative library, Wand, which handles animated GIFs. Or you might want to use another library for feature detection, something in the way that we described earlier. And at the moment, I think it's a bit confusing for Wagtail implementers to know which library to use in which case, and whether they need to install them all. And actually, in some cases, the act of installing those may be less straightforward than you might like. So my colleague Carl, who's one of the main developers of Wagtail, he launched a project called Willow on GitHub, which is designed to be a kind of an abstraction on top of the other image libraries. So it's a kind of umbrella one, which means that if you have Willow and you have and the underlying libraries, then it will carry out the image manipulation that you need using the library that's best suited to the task. That's something that's been helpful for us in kind of making sure that Wagtail's image support is as strong as possible. Another one is around the ability to cluster models, Django models, and to relate and to connect them together without saving them to the database. This is, sounds like a slightly kind of obscure requirement, but actually I think it's the lack of this feature which has meant that a lot of other Django-based CMSs have relied heavily on the admin. the built-in admin interface. So a key thing that this limitation in Django makes difficult is a preview. So if you want to, if you have your set of form fields and you fill them all in, and you want to see what your content looks like, in standard Django you have to save that to the database, and then you have a template. Then you have a view which pulls up from the database and shows it. And maybe you just save it to the database in a new table, or you give it or you using versions or something, and you give it a toggle it to show that it's just in preview mode. But that can quickly become unwieldy. So my colleague Matthew, the lead Wagtail developer, open sourced Django model cluster, which is a library which makes it possible to do this grouping of models before they hit the database. So you can use it for previews, or perhaps for serializing these clusters of models and sending them to another system without having to send them in the database. So it's a slightly obscure feature, I think, or slightly obscure limitation of Django, but one that once you have a solution for it, you realize that there are some interesting possibilities become possible. So those are two areas which we've addressed by providing libraries, but those libraries, of course, can be improved themselves. I think for me the main shortcoming in Django, or really all Python web applications, is still around ease of deployment. And here at Torchbox we've got someone in today for a work experience. He's a really, really smart guy called Jack. He's 15 years old, and he's been building websites. He's made websites for his friends, and he understands how to upload a PHP file to a server and edit it and see it change. But I realised, sitting down with him this morning and explaining what he'd need to do for the equivalent in a Wagtail site, there's a lot of steps for him to understand, or not even necessarily understand, but to know that he has to do before you get to that point of seeing your beautiful work online. And I guess I'd imagined 5 years ago that by now this part of building a Python-based website would be easier. And I know there are some great tools, and the Heroku model works really well, and there's some good Python hosting outfits. And actually, interestingly, Django CMS, which is probably the best known content management system in Django, which is backed by Divio, they have a system called Aldrin, which is really a step towards making it easier to host Django, and certainly Django CMS based sites, and probably other Python based sites in the future. But I think it's disappointing that hasn't got easier, and I don't think it's anyone's fault. And but I think that's probably the key impediment for something like Wagtail or another Django CMS becoming a serious a contender to something like WordPress in the sort of mainstream web development.
So are there any questions that we didn't ask that you think we should have, or any topics that you want to bring up before we move on to the next section?
Maybe about plans for Wagtail in the next few months. So Wagtail is currently at 1.4, 1.4.3 to be exact, and we're aiming to have a fairly kind of regular rhythm of releases, and the goal is release about every 6 weeks, and the idea of that rhythm is that it should be easy enough to upgrade between versions that it doesn't put people off. So hopefully in most cases it would be an hour or less of your time to upgrade. In most cases it should just be changing the line in your requirements.txt and running a migration. But also there should be enough features in each release to make it compelling to do that, and to get people for people who are using Wagtail to feel excited about each release. So, and it feels like with the resources we have at the moment and the velocity of the community, that about every 6 weeks is about right for us. So the next release is 1.5, and the key feature here is the inclusion of Wagtail Model Admin, which I mentioned before, the ability to manage either other Django models or in a way within the Wagtail admin itself, and there's a host of other features as well. In the next 2 or 3 versions, I think there's going to be a focus on 2 things. One is the user interface, and with this move towards a React-based front end, which is going to be led by Springload, who are the excellent New Zealand agency I mentioned earlier, and that requires this cleaner separation of models and front ends, and we're achieving that through the development of the admin API. Those are the 2 main features, the main directions for the forthcoming months. But I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to star the project on GitHub and to keep track, to join the mailing list, and hopefully to feel a little moment of delight each time a new version lands.
All right. So for anybody who wants to keep in touch with you and follow what you're up to, what would be the best way for them to do that?
So we're tweeting at Wagtail CMS. The main project site is wagtail.io, which is going to be refreshed in a month or 2, I hope. And but most of the activity happens on the GitHub project, which is github.com/torchbox/wagtail.
So with that, we will move it on into the picks. For my first pick today, I'm going to choose pumpkin pie because it is delicious and I love it. And it's probably one of my favorite pies ever. And my wife was nice enough to make me one recently.
Well, for my pick, I'm going to continue on the gastronomic line, and I'm pretty serious about coffee, and I've just got some new beans which I'm really happy with. They're Ethiopian. They're from a company called Has Been here in the UK, and I ground them this morning, and I on my Hario V60, and it was a delicious cup of coffee that I'm feeling really good about.
Great. What was the name of the grinder you said?
It's it's Hario V60.
All right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to tell us more about Wagtail and the work you've been doing on it. And I'm sure there are a number of people who will be excited to learn about some of the features that it makes available to them. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.